Cuda Cody back with you. This is part 3 of our how to restore an E-body steering column. And what you see out in front of me is the 1970 steering column that we disassembled. And I've got it organized by the type of finishes that we are going to be reproducing. So inside this yellow box, you'll notice that everything in here is going to have a suede finish. This is the same suede that's on the dash and on the ashtray and on the glove box. And if you move over here, everything inside this little box, this is all going to be semi-gloss black. Some of these things you will see, like the steering column shaft under the hood. So we want to make sure we get the right finish on that. Inside this blue box, this is all natural or a plated finish. This lockout tube, for example, is a natural finish, but they spot welded this zinc dichromate lockout arm on it. So we're going to reproduce that, and we're going to go through and show you how to do all that stuff in there. We've got this black box. Everything in there is either black oxide or a phosphate finish. So don't worry, it looks like a lot of parts, but I can assure you that if you want to restore your own E-body steering column, I'm going to help you, and I know you can do it. So next step is actually to start cleaning up and getting all of this grease that is in here off before we can sandblast it. We also want to make sure that we take care of the machine parts that go together. So when we blast it, we're going to tape all that off so we don't put any sand material up against it. Also, when we were taking these apart, we put all the fasteners back in their home. They like to be in their little home, you know, so but now they can't stay there. We got to take them out. And how are we going to remember where they go? Well, here's a neat little trick. You can actually print off a picture of the fasteners in place, and then all you do is poke a hole where they go, and this will make them feel like they're at home even though they're not there. And when you go to reuse them, you can just reach in, grab the one you need, and you know it's going to go back in the right spot. So this is kind of our last chance to take a look at everything before we start completely refinishing it and painting it. So good chance that you want to look at all your threads on your steering shaft, make sure that your splines are all nice. And if you've got any bends in your metal and your plate, this is a good time to hammer them out. So let's go ahead and move over to the parts washer. We'll start cleaning up all the grease, and we'll get started on reconditioning these parts. Okay, we're over at the parts washer, and if you don't have a parts washer, you can use anything like soap and water or a degreaser. All we need to do is we need to remove all the grease in this component because we want to make sure we have a nice clean part to work with. So let's go ahead and get started getting it cleaned up. Getting ready to do some sandblasting, and now we've got a clean part, but we've got to tape it off so none of the sand gets in on the machine surfaces. So as you can see, I've already taped off the inside of this, and now all I got to do is I'm going to block off sand from even getting in there, even though it's already protected. So take my last piece of tape here and just put it right over the top of that, and now it's sealed off. So I'm going to go ahead and get started blasting and get these parts cleaned up and ready to be painted. Everything's been sandblasted, blown off really well, cleaned up, and now we've got it hung up here in our paint booth. Everything is organized with like items. This stuff up here, this is going to be semi-gloss. Back here, we've got everything that's going to be painted suede. I've also included the ashtray, the glove box, and the dash. And the reason being is those are also suede just like the steering column. And it's important that we paint those at the same time. That way everything looks the same. We also want to pay close attention to how we hang these items. We want them all top side up, so that way when we're painting them, any possible texture that might just hang a little different with gravity, it will all look uniform throughout the whole thing. I've got the steering column tubes hung up. That makes it super easy to get all the way around it and paint it. But if you don't have a paint booth or don't have enough area to actually hang things up, you can do it on a table, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you that you can set this stuff up on a table and get fantastic results. You can do it in your garage. I've even seen people do it outside on a calm day. So we're going to duplicate a table situation so that you can paint this at home if you don't have a paint booth. Next step is to get everything into epoxy. Let's go over and get some epoxy mixed up. This is real exciting. We've already done all the hard work, disassembling, cleaning up, prepping all the parts to get repainted. Now it's time to mix up some suede finish, and let's get this painted and looking really good. This is lacquer paint, this suede finish that we're going to be painting today, which is actually called jewel black. It's the black color. They make bayou green, they make the red, the blue. You can get the suede finish in all the interior colors that were available in e-bodies. This is 9324. It's actually mixed at a 1 to 1.5 ratio, meaning that I'm going to use 1 part paint to 1.5 parts thinner. Now, all this information is available in what's called a P sheet. This is a spec sheet, instruction sheet, but PPG makes this for every product that they sell. And you'll look on this sheet and you'll be able to see what the product can be placed over. The second one down here tells me it can be placed over epoxy. It's also going to tell me everything I need to know about how to mix the product. So this will tell me that it's going to be mixed at a 1 to 1.5 ratio. It's going to tell me the pot life, which in this situation does not have a pot life because we're not actually adding a catalyst. So we're just going to be thinning it down. We could put it back into a storage can and store it, and we could use it next month, 2 months, next summer. As long as it's stored properly, it's going to stay. Also, it's going to tell us what fluid tip to use with it. In this situation, it's telling us a 1.2 to 1.5. I'm going to be using a 1.3 fluid tip. All this information is available. How soon you can recoat, everything you need to know about it. So these spec sheets are really nice to have when you're using a PPG product. This is spec sheet P148 and this is P196 for the epoxy. Now the epoxy, we're going to be placing this down on the metal, the bare metal, to protect it. This is actually a 2-part component. So it's got a catalyst that's going to harden the epoxy and create a really rock solid protection for our steering column. Now this is 2 to 1, meaning 2 parts of paint to 1 part of the catalyst. That information is available again. You can see it on the side of the can, or you can look in the spec sheet. It's going to tell you everything you need to know. With epoxy, depending on which catalyst, you're going to have anywhere from 8 hours to 72 hours pot life. So that means once I mix it, in this situation I'm using 402, I'm going to have 8 hours to spray it, and then at that point I don't want to use the paint anymore. Because I'm using a 1.3 tip, they do call for a 1.4, I think 1.4 to 1.5. I'm going to go ahead and put a splash of thinner in it, and it does spec that out that that's okay to do, and then it'll spray through this gun a little easier. But if you don't have the thinner and you're using a 1.3 tip, you'll be fine at mixing this 2 to 1. It'll still go through. So a couple things to keep in mind is if you're looking for this paint, you might be able to find it locally. You can get it online still and you can order it, but try checking with your local paint store that supplies paint for automotive industries. So this is a lacquer, so just call them up and say, do you sell PPG lacquer? It's called DDL, Duracryl. And if they don't, they might be able to refer you to somebody locally who does. The main part in this is the texture that makes the suede, and this is the hard part to get. And when I say it's hard, it's not like they don't make it. They still make this. They just don't stock it. Not many people stock it anymore. And it's called DMA 364. So anybody that sells the lacquer is probably going to have to order some of this in for you. So it might take a little bit. But if you can't find it locally, go ahead and order some online. Another thing to consider when you're spraying this is, unlike my normal paints or primers that I'm going to filter through when I mix it into my gun, and then also have another filter in my cup that I use, I don't want to do that with this because it has a texture in it, that suede. I want to go ahead and make sure that I take any filter that I'm using and remove it so it doesn't get filtered at all, because you don't want to take that texture out. So keep that in mind. So what I'm going to do is, I've already shaken all this stuff up. I'm going to go ahead and start mixing up my paint. And I do use the PPG cups because they always make it real easy, because all their mix ratios are built into it. So if you look on the side of a cup, you're going to see a ratio of like 2 to 1 for this situation for the epoxy. And for the Duracryl, you'll see a 1 to 1.5. And what that means is, underneath the number, like the 1 part, I can go down and I can see all these little dashes, and they'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All I have to do is pour the paint or the thinner in up to that number. You know, for in this situation, I'm going to be doing 2 to 1, so I might pour it up to the number 4, and then take my catalyst and go to the next column over and go up to number 4. That'll give me the right ratio. If that confuses you, because some people don't like using that method, you could simply use an ounce scale on the side. So if this is 2 to 1, if I put in 10 ounces of this paint, this primer, I got to put in 5 ounces of this. That'll give me 2 to 1. And in this situation over here, my 1 to 1.5, let's say I put in 10 ounces of paint, I've got to put in now 15 ounces of my thinner to get it to 1 to 1.5. So it's important that you mix to the right ratio to make sure that these products work well. So the last thing before I get started mixing is, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to paint everything well, I say paint, I'm going to primer it with epoxy. And that's done pretty normal with a normal paint gun fan at a normal distance. When you go to shoot this suede, it's important to practice a little bit. You might want to just have a couple practice pieces that you can work with, because the distance that you keep the gun away from your subject, the item that you're painting, and the speed in which you go can drastically change how the actual end result looks, because this stuff does have a texture in it. If your item you're painting is laying flat, what's going to happen is when you go over it and you put it on there a little thick, it's going to give it time for that texture to kind of lay down, and it's going to look different than if it was hanging sideways and you were further back and went faster and it was a little bit drier. Then it doesn't give it, it dries maybe even, you know, so that the texture doesn't have a chance to lay down. So it's important that you set up everything that's going to be in the car at the kind of the same angle and just go around at the same speed, but give yourself a chance to practice and test the speed in which you want to go so you can kind of get the right look. Because if you're too far back and you dry spray it, it'll end up with too much texture. And if you're too close, it'll end up with just almost no texture. So do some practicing, and I think you'll end up finding what you like. But I'll let you guys see how I do it, and I'll show you the end results. And so let's get mixing here. So the epoxy's all down, and I've been spraying some suede, and I want you to watch me on how I do this, because the technique is very important. What you want to do is you want to put enough paint down so that it's wet and not dry, not light, because if you go light, you'll see that it's actually like almost a matte finish as you're applying it, so that's not enough paint. If you're applying too much, you're either going to get drips, or it's going to be so glossy that when you're applying it, you almost don't see any texture. You want to see some texture, and you want that texture to look wet. So I'm going to have you watch me, and I'm spraying on the table, so you'll notice that I've got little caps off rattle cans that I'm setting everything on, and that's so it doesn't stick to the table. Everything is also being set one direction, all faced up, so that everything will dry the same. So I'm going to have you peek in and see how I do this, and just kind of mimic that speed and technique to practice with, and you'll get it, and it'll look really good. All right, the suede paint is all dry and it looks wonderful. I want to share with you what I did on this side of the dash. I dry sprayed it because that's the most common problem people have. They put it on there too light. And what happens when you dry spray it is you get too much texture. And when you go to actually wipe it down or detail it, you'll try to wipe it and it'll stick like Velcro. So you don't want that. It's just way too much texture, and you need to be able to run a rag over it and have it not grab. So the right look and feel would be to have it smooth enough that you can actually run a rag over it and it'll just wipe right off. It won't stick at all. And the way you can tell when you're spraying it, like I said earlier, is if you got it right, you're going to see that when you're putting it down, you still see a little texture, but the paint looks glossy. You can actually see a shine to it. If you put it on too dry, you'll actually only see the texture, and it'll almost look dry as you're spraying it. So that's the dry side. If you put it on there too thick, you're either going to get runs, and you can tell when you're close to getting runs because it'll look so glossy that you won't even see any texture at all. So then you're on the borderline of, okay, it might drip. So hopefully that helps you. Practice a little bit, and when you get it right, you're going to love the finish of it. There's nothing better than an E-body steering column and dash that has a beautiful suede finish. It just looks so great in an E-body. Let's get all this stuff moved out, and let's get started assembling the steering column.